In the sun-drenched lanes of the French Quarter, Bhavani Sundaram begins her day with the mindful art of arranging marigolds. As she shares sweets and stories with a small circle of friends, she quietly questions if she truly belongs in their warm embrace. Join Bhavani in this gentle journey of courage and contentment as she discovers the joy of profound belonging. The scent of dawn. The needle slid through the velvet heart of an orange marigold with a soft, rhythmic hiss. Bhavani Sundaram held the thread taut, the tension a thin line of certainty in the early gray of the morning. Each flower was a small, condensed sun, heavy with the moisture that clung to her fingertips. She didn't rush the process. To rush would be to bruise the petals, to force a geometry that the blossoms didn't intend. She worked in the dim light of her veranda, where the air still tasted of salt and damp stone, the scent of the crushed stems rising around her like a green, peppery fog. Across the quiet stretch of the lane, a temple bell chimed. The sound wasn't a sharp alarm, but a low, resonant vibration that seemed to ripple through the very floorboards beneath her feet, signaling the town's slow awakening. Bhavani paused, her hands hovering over the brass tray. She didn't look up immediately. Instead, she let the sound settle, listening to the way it decayed into the silence of the French Quarter. It was the hour when the world felt fragile, a porcelain bowl balanced on a narrow ledge, and she felt a sudden, instinctive need to move with a lightness that bordered on invisibility. She reached down to smooth the fold of her cotton saree, her palm grazing the fabric in a slow, deliberate sweep. The cotton was crisp, smelling of sun-dried linens and a hint of sandalwood. She adjusted the drape over her shoulder, ensuring not a single crease disrupted the line of the cloth. It was a small ritual of containment. To be tidy was to be unobtrusive, and to be unobtrusive was to be safe. She tilted her head, listening to the distant, muted sounds of a broom sweeping a courtyard and the far-off call of a crow, feeling as though any sudden movement on her part might shatter the morning's equilibrium. On the brass tray, the garlands lay in concentric circles, a vivid orange contrast against the dull gold of the metal. As she shifted the tray to check the alignment, she noticed a single petal, a tiny curved shard of gold that had drifted away from its bloom. It lay isolated on the brass, a minute flaw in the composition. Bhavani didn't simply brush it aside. She leaned in, her breath catching, and used the tip of her finger to nudge the petal back into the fold of the flower from which it had escaped. She pressed it gently, ensuring it rested in harmony with the others. The need for order was not about perfection, but about a quiet kind of peace that could only be found when everything was exactly where it belonged. This meticulousness, however, came with a cost. She glanced at the wall clock, the ticking sound now audible in the void left by the temple bell. She was behind. The temple would be filling with the early devotees, and the peak morning crowd, the rush of people seeking the freshest offerings before the heat of the day took hold, would already be gathering. If she arrived late, she would miss the window of stillness, and she would be forced to navigate the press of bodies, the loud exchanges of the marketplace, and the sudden, jarring visibility of the crowd. The thought caused a small, cold knot to tighten in her stomach. She knew the risk, yet she found herself spending another 5 minutes adjusting the tie of a smaller bouquet, ensuring the knot was hidden beneath a lush layer of petals. She paused, closing her eyes and inhaling deeply. The scent of the crushed marigold surged upward, thick and earthy, cutting through the salt air. It was a scent that anchored her, a sensory tether that pulled her out of the spinning worry of the clock and back into the physical reality of her hands. The smell was honest. It didn't demand anything of her. It simply existed. As she breathed it in, the internal flutter of anxiety, the fear of being seen, of taking up too much space in a world that felt too loud, began to subside. She was not a person in a crowd. She was simply the keeper of the flowers. Bhavani moved toward the small, polished mirror hanging by the door. The glass was old, silvering at the edges, giving her reflection a ghostly, ethereal quality. She studied herself, the silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, the soft lines around her eyes, the way she seemed to shrink slightly into the folds of her saree. She tilted her head, studying the woman in the glass. There was a quiet joy residing in her chest, a humming warmth that came from the act of creation and the anticipation of giving. But as she stared, a sudden, piercing doubt surfaced. Was this joy too small? Was it a fragile thing that would be crushed if she tried to share it with the bustling, chaotic energy of Pondicherry? She wondered if she was merely a shadow moving through a city of bright lights, a silent note in a loud symphony, and if her brand of kindness was too muted to be heard. She lingered there for a moment, caught between the desire to be known and the terror of being noticed. To be known was a warmth, to be noticed was a glare. She smoothed her saree once more, a gesture of armor, and decided that the silence was enough. The flowers would speak for her. They were the bridge between her solitude and the world, a way to offer beauty without having to offer herself. When she finally stepped outside, the golden light of the morning had fully arrived, painting the whitewashed walls of the French Quarter in shades of honey and cream. The air was warmer now, carrying the scent of baking bread and blooming night bloom scent. The street was still mostly empty, the cobblestones glistening with a thin sheen of dew. She began to walk, the brass tray balanced carefully in her grip, her steps light and rhythmic, blending into the cadence of the waking town. As she reached the edge of her gate, something caught her eye. Tucked into the wrought iron scrollwork was a small, cream-colored piece of stationery, folded neatly in half. It wasn't a bill or a flyer. The paper was thick, textured, and looked as though it had been handled with care. Bhavani stopped, her heart skipping a beat. She set the tray down on the stone step with a careful, metal-sharp clink and reached for the note. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was an elegant, flowing script, the ink a deep, midnight blue that seemed to shimmer against the cream background. There was no greeting, no formal introduction. The note simply read, "I have heard that the marigolds of the lane are the only things in this city that truly know how to be still. Could you bring a bouquet to the bookshop at the end of the street? I find I cannot begin my day without a reminder of what stillness looks like." Bhavani stared at the words, the ink blurring for a second. She didn't know who had written this. She didn't know who had been watching her, or who had spoken of her flowers in such a way. The idea of a stranger desiring her work was exhilarating, but the request for her to enter a place, a destination, a bookshop, felt like a summons. She looked down at her marigolds, then back at the note. For the first time in years, the fear of being seen was momentarily eclipsed by a profound, quiet curiosity. She picked up the tray, the weight of the flowers now feeling like a secret she was carrying toward an unknown door. The pastel promenade. The soles of Bhavani's sandals clicked a steady, tentative rhythm against the cobblestones, a sound that felt far too loud in the suspended silence of the French Quarter. She held the brass tray with a grip that made her knuckles pale, the marigolds trembling slightly in the morning breeze. The air was a thick, sweet suspension of salt from the coast and the scent of damp lime-wash. Every few steps, Bhavani paused, her gaze drifting to the bougainvillea spilling over white walls in violent splashes of magenta, wondering if the person who wrote the note was still waiting, or if the invitation had been a whim of the wind. She felt a strange, humming tension in her chest, a fragile bridge between the safety of her solitude and the risk of being seen. At the corner of Rue Dumas, the rhythm of her walk was interrupted by a sharp, metal-sharp snap. Kishore Iyer stood there, his posture a rigid vertical line against the soft curve of a pastel blue wall. He was staring intently at a silver pocket watch, the chain looping precisely across his waistcoat. He looked up as Bhavani approached, his eyes scanning her with the clinical efficiency of a ledger. 3 minutes behind the usual flow of traffic, Mrs. Sundaram, Kishore said, his voice clipped and rhythmic, each syllable landing like a stamp on a document. He didn't smile, but his tone lacked malice. It was simply a statement of fact. The morning's pace is remarkably irregular today. One would think a holiday would encourage a more structured celebration, yet the streets behave as if the clocks have simply ceased to function. Bhavani tilted her head, her voice low and melodic. Perhaps the clocks are just resting, Mr. Iyer. The flowers don't bloom on a schedule. Kishore opened his mouth to counter, his finger hovering over the glass of his watch, but a sudden, rich laugh echoed from the alleyway behind them. Hema Rao appeared like a sudden bloom of warmth, her presence filling the narrow space. She wore a saree the color of a bruised plum, and her eyes twinkled with a permanent, secret amusement. "Still fighting with time, Kishore?" Hema asked, her voice enveloping them both like a heavy, hand-woven blanket. She reached out and patted Bhavani's shoulder, a gesture of grounding affection that made Bhavani instinctively smooth the cotton of her sari. Time is a suggestion on a morning like this. What is a few minutes when the air tastes like sugar? From the folds of her cloth, Hema produced a small, leaf-lined basket containing honey-soaked sweets, their surfaces glistening with a sticky golden sheen. The scent hit them immediately, cardamom and deep burnt sugar. Hema held the basket between the two of them, an offering that demanded a silence in the machinery of the day. "Stop," Hema insisted, her open palms gesturing to the street. "The world will not stop spinning if you miss your appointment with a minute hand. Eat, taste the morning." Bhavani reached into the basket, her fingers brushing the cool, tacky surface of a sweet. She held it out to Kishore, the golden syrup dripping slowly, a single amber bead hanging from the edge. Kishore stared at the sweet as if it were a mathematical error. His gaze flickered from the honey to his watch, his jaw tight, the internal struggle visible in the slight twitch of his brow. He seemed to be calculating the cost of the interruption, weighing the disruption of his routine against the visceral pull of the scent. Finally, the scent of honey won. He accepted the sweet with a precise movement, his fingers barely touching Bhavani's. As he ate, the rigidity in his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The sweetness was a surrender. "Efficiency is the only thing that keeps a city from dissolving into chaos, Hema," Kishore said, though the bite was gone from his voice, replaced by a soft, sugar-induced haze. Hema chuckled, a deep sound that seemed to vibrate in the cobblestones. She leaned back against a wall painted a shade of pale primrose, her eyes drifting upward. "Chaos is where the memories live, Kishore. Do you remember the Holi of '74? The entire street was a canvas. I remember the mayor's wife accidentally tipping a bucket of crimson powder over a visiting diplomat from Lyon. We spent 3 days laughing every time we saw a red smudge on a white collar. The walls of this quarter have seen 1,000 such mornings, and not one of them was efficient." They drifted further down the lane, the conversation winding like the streets themselves. They came to a halt beside a wall of such an intense, saturated yellow that it seemed to radiate its own heat. Against the piercing blue of the cloudless sky, the contrast was almost violent, a visual chord that struck a deep note of awe. Bhavani stopped, the brass tray forgotten for a moment. She felt a sudden sharp spike of interiority, a realization that she had spent so many years blending into the whitewash of the background that she had forgotten how to be a color. Why had she stayed in the shadows for so long? The yellow wall was a challenge, a reminder that it was possible to be bright without being broken. She felt a strange, fluttering longing to step forward, to occupy the space she had always yielded to others, to be as unapologetic as the paint on the stone. Kishore, noticing the lingering silence, cleared his throat. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the intersection. "If we are to proceed toward the center, the most logical route is through the main artery. It saves 4 minutes and avoids the congestion of the market square." He began to gesture toward the wide, paved road, his voice regaining its authoritative, quick cadence. He was attempting to steer them back into the safety of a grid, to reclaim the order that the honey and the yellow wall had eroded. However, Hema was faster. With a subtle, sweeping motion of her hand and a soft word about a particular night-bloom scent vine that only bloomed in the shade, she diverted them. She led them away from the efficiency of the main road and into a narrow, flower-lined alley where the sunlight filtered through the canopy in jagged, golden shards. The air here was cooler, smelling of damp earth and crushed mint. Bhavani followed, her heart light, feeling as though they were slipping through a crack in the world where the clocks couldn't reach them. As they turned a sharp corner, the alley opened slightly, revealing a small plaza. Bhavani's eyes drifted to the periphery, and there she saw him. A man sat on a low stone wall, a sketchbook propped on his knee. He was Ishan. Though she did not yet know his name, she only knew the way he held his charcoal, his fingers smudged with gray and ochre. He was sketching them, the trio of the flower seller, the clock watcher, and the matriarch, capturing the curve of Hema's laugh and the stiffness of Kishore's spine. But as Bhavani caught his eye, Ishan didn't smile or wave. His gaze shifted. He looked past her, his eyes widening, his focus locking onto something behind her with a sudden piercing intensity. The charcoal in his hand paused mid-stroke, and his expression shifted from artistic curiosity to a look of profound, startled recognition, as if he had just seen a ghost materialize out of the morning mist. The sanctuary of pages. Bhavani spun around, the movement catching the fabric of her cotton sari against her ankles. The air in the plaza had suddenly thickened, the silence between her and Ishan vibrating like a plucked string. She looked back, expecting a stranger or perhaps a stray dog, but there was only the narrow mouth of the alley and the distant, rhythmic chime of a bicycle bell. When she turned back to the artist, Ishan was still frozen, his charcoal pencil hovering a fraction of an inch above the cream-colored paper of his sketchbook. His eyes weren't on her face, but on the space just over her left shoulder, wide and searching, as if he were trying to resolve a blurred image into a sharp one. "Who is it?" Bhavani asked, her voice a low, melodic ripple in the quiet. She tilted her head, the habitual gesture of someone used to listening for things others ignored. Ishan blinked, the spell breaking. He looked down at his sketch and then back at her, his expression shifting from shock to a confused, lingering wonder. He rubbed a smudge of gray charcoal onto his thumb, a slow, grounding motion. "No one," he murmured, his tone hushed and respectful, though his eyes remained unsettled. "I thought, for a moment, the light played a trick. I thought I saw someone from a very long time ago." Kishore stepped forward, his pocket watch already out, the silver casing glinting in a shard of sunlight. "The light is indeed deceptive in these corridors, and we are now 6 minutes behind the projected arrival. The bookshop does not remain open indefinitely, and the marigolds will begin to wilt if they are not placed in water." His voice was a precise instrument, cutting through the atmospheric haze of the plaza. He didn't look at Ishan. He studied the path ahead, his spine a rigid line of civic duty. Hema let out a soft, enveloping chuckle that sounded like a warm blanket. She reached out and patted Bhavani's shoulder, her palm a steady, comforting weight. "Leave the ghost to the artists, Kishore. Some things are meant to be felt and not scheduled." She nudged Bhavani forward with an open palm gesture, guiding her toward the end of the alley where a heavy oak door stood recessed into a limestone wall. Bhavani felt the familiar urge to retreat, to slide back into the whitewash of the background and let Hema and Kishore lead the way. But the note in her pocket, the elegant, looping script that had called her here, felt like a warm coal against her hip. She stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the iron handle. As she pushed the door open, a small brass bell chimed, a singular, clear note that announced her intrusion into a world of suspended time. The interior of the bookshop was a cathedral of dust motes and silence. The air was cool, smelling deeply of old paper, vanilla, and the sharp, bright citrus of a freshly baked lemon cake resting on a marble counter. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of mahogany groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes, their spines a mosaic of faded crimsons and deep ochres. The light here didn't fall in shards, but filtered through high, clouded windows in a soft, milky haze that blurred the edges of the room. Behind the counter stood a woman with wire-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of a narrow nose. She was dusting the cover of a large folio with her fingertips, her movements rhythmic and archival. This was Natalie Lefebvre. She didn't look up immediately. She seemed to be in a private conversation with the book in her hands. Bhavani paused, her breath hitching. She felt the sudden, crushing weight of her own invisibility, the sense that she was a smudge of color in a room dedicated to the preservation of the past. "Bonjour," Natalie said, her voice a soft, breathy cadence that carried the ghost of a French accent. She looked up, and her gaze was not the piercing scrutiny Bhavani feared, but a quiet, curious observation. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning Bhavani with a gentle softness. "You have the look of a person who has brought the morning inside with them." Bhavani stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. She tentatively placed the bundle of marigolds on the marble counter, the vibrant orange petals contrasting sharply against the white stone. "For you," Bhavani whispered, her voice barely audible, a slow stream of sound. "A gift for the holly morning. I received a note." Natalie froze. Her gaze shifted from the flowers to Bhavani's face, and for a moment, the sanctuary of the bookshop felt fragile, as if a loud noise might shatter the stillness. She didn't reach for the flowers immediately. Instead, she studied the marigolds as if they were a foreign language she was trying to translate. Then, slowly, her hand moved. She touched a petal with a tenderness that mirrored the way she handled her books. The act of accepting the flowers seemed to be a physical breaking of a shell. Her shoulders dropped, and the guardedness in her expression dissolved into a weary, luminous smile. "Thank you," Natalie murmured. "It has been a very long time since the morning was brought to me in this way." Bhavani lingered, her hand instinctively smoothing the cotton of her saree. She drifted toward a nearby shelf of poetry, the titles embossed in gold leaf. She ran her finger along the spines, feeling the texture of cloth and vellum, but as she did, a familiar anxiety crept in. She felt the periphery of the room closing in, the sense that she was an interloper in a private sanctuary. She began to step backward, her feet searching for the exit, her voice already forming a polite apology for the intrusion. "You are not finished here," Natalie's voice caught her. It wasn't a command, but a gentle invitation. Bhavani stopped, half-turned toward the door. Natalie had moved around the counter, carrying a small porcelain plate. On it sat a slice of lemon cake, the yellow crumb moist and topped with a dusting of powdered sugar. The scent of citrus surged forward, cutting through the musk of the old books. "Please," Natalie said, stepping into Bhavani's space. "Stay. Occupy the room. I find that the silence of this shop is too heavy when it is only my own. I would prefer it shared." Bhavani took the plate, her fingers brushing Natalie's. The cake was tart and sweet, the flavor exploding on her tongue with a brightness that matched the marigolds on the counter. As she ate, she felt a strange, grounding warmth. For the first time in years, the act of taking up space didn't feel like a transgression. It felt like a permission. Her eyes wandered to a heavy oak table in the center of the room, where a book lay open, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Beside it sat a pair of reading glasses and a fountain pen. Drawn by a sudden, inexplicable pull, Bhavani stepped closer. She leaned in, the scent of the cake still lingering in her nostrils, and looked at the open page. Pressed between the leaves of the book was a single, dried flower, a night bloom scent, bloom, now a translucent brown, preserved in the vacuum of the pages. Beneath the flower was a handwritten letter, the ink faded to a ghostly sepia. Bhavani's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to read the entire letter to feel the jolt of electricity strike her spine. There, in the third line, written in a hand that looked hauntingly familiar, was her own family name, followed by a date from 40 years ago and a request for a meeting that had clearly never happened. Courtyard circle. Violet paint bled across the watercolor paper, a blooming bruise of color. Ishan fought to keep from blurring. He held his breath, brush hovering, waiting for the water to saturate the fiber. He wasn't painting the courtyard so much as the way the light filtered through the bougainvillea, turning the air into a translucent amethyst haze. The world outside the shop had ceased to be a city of schedules. It had become a study in saturation. Kishore entered with his usual measured stride, the click of his leather sandals rhythmic against the cool limestone. He stopped beside the stone table and glanced at the pocket watch that had governed his life for 30 years. For a moment, the old habit flared, the urge to synchronize the hour, to ensure the morning hadn't slipped into inefficiency. Then, with a deliberate motion, he turned the watch face down on the stone. He let out a sigh that deflated the rigid posture of his shoulders. "The light is particularly stubborn today," Kishore remarked, his voice clear and precise, though the authority had softened. He squinted at the canvas. "You've captured the hue, perhaps, but the geometry is skewed. The angle of the archway is off by several degrees." Ishan didn't look up, rubbing a smudge of cobalt blue into his knuckle. "Geometry is for architects, Kishore. I'm painting the feeling of the shadow. The archway doesn't need to be straight if the mood is right. The air feels curved this morning, doesn't it?" Before the disagreement could crystallize, Hema arrived with a heavy brass tray. The scent of cardamom and ginger surged forward, a warm cloud cutting through the dampness of the stone walls. She set the tray down with maternal firmness, the porcelain cups clinking. "Enough of measurements and moods," Hema said with a knowing chuckle. She gestured for them to gather. "The tea is at its peak, and the morning is too short for you to argue over a line on a page. Nathalie, dear, come away from your ledgers. The sun has finally found the center of the courtyard." Nathalie emerged from the dim interior of the bookshop, her wire-rimmed glasses sliding down her nose. She looked as though she had been plucked from another century, her movements hesitant, as if afraid to disturb the silence she had curated for so long. She took her place in the circle, fingers instinctively dusting her cardigan. Bhavani sat at the edge of the group, her body angled away like a guest who hadn't quite been invited to stay. She listened to the tapestry of their voices, Kishore's clipped precision, Ishan's breathless enthusiasm, and Nathalie's soft French cadence. It was a strange chord struck in a quiet alley. In her lap, she felt the phantom weight of the letter she had discovered in the book, the 40-year-old mystery humming in her blood, but she pushed the anxiety back. She watched Hema pour the tea, the liquid a deep, burnt orange, steaming in slow curls. "I remember when this courtyard was a place of meetings," Hema began, her eyes drifting toward the weathered walls. "Before the shops became sanctuaries and the houses became museums. We shared stories here that lasted until the moon climbed over the rooftops. We spoke of things that didn't fit into schedules." Kishore shifted, his expression tightening. "Stories are pleasant, Hema, but imprecise. Structure is what allows a community to function. Without the schedule, the morning is merely a drift of time." "And that is exactly why it is beautiful," Ishan countered, a challenging smile on his lips. "The drift is where the art happens. If you map every second, you miss the way the light changes from gold to silver. You're seeing the bone of the morning, Kishore, but you're missing the skin." The air grew taut, a friction that threatened the peace of the afternoon. Kishore opened his mouth to deliver a reasoned rebuttal, his finger twitching toward the face-down watch. Bhavani felt the tension like a physical pressure, a discordant note in the symphony. She didn't like conflict. It felt like a storm that might wash away the fragile belonging she had just begun to feel. She leaned forward, her voice low, cutting through the tension like a cool breeze. "The tea smells of rain on hot earth," she whispered, eyes fixed on the steam. "Do you smell that? Not just the ginger, but the scent of the garden after a sudden shower. It's the smell of things beginning again." Both men paused. The observation was so simple it acted as a grounding wire. Kishore blinked, his gaze following Bhavani's to the cup. He took a deep breath of cardamom, the rigidity in his jaw vanishing. He studied the tea, then Bhavani, and finally the watch he had abandoned. A rare smile touched his mouth. "It does," Kishore admitted softly. "It smells of a very specific kind of renewal." Ishan looked at his painting, then at the group. He saw Hima's hand on Nathalie's shoulder, and the way Bhavani's presence had quietly stitched the moment back together. He realized he had spent the last hour trying to trap the morning on paper, treating his friends as mere elements of a composition. With a decisive movement, Ishan set his brush down on the palette. He didn't wash it or cap the paint, he simply let it lie. He pushed the easel back, stepping fully into the circle. The painting remained unfinished, the violet bloom wet, the archway skewed, but he no longer cared. The lived experience of the friendship was more vibrant than any pigment he could mix. For a long while, they existed in a shared suspension of time. They spoke of small things, local honey, the way the French Quarter felt like a dream of a city that never quite woke up. Natalie laughed, a light, airy sound, and for the first time, she didn't retreat into her books. She leaned in, contributing memories of her grandfather's stories. As the laughter peaked, a heavy shadow stretched across the limestone floor, cutting through the sunlight like a blade. The group fell silent, the warmth cooling instantly. They all looked up. High above them, on the wrought iron balcony of the adjacent building, a figure stood motionless. Draped in a shawl of deep indigo, their face partially obscured by the shade of the eaves, the stranger's gaze was fixed intently on Bhavani. There was no wave, no greeting, only a piercing, silent observation that felt like a question asked 40 years too late. As the figure turned and vanished into the darkness of the upper room, the silence that returned to the courtyard was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of a person who had been waiting for them to be found. Hold in repose. The velvet of the armchair was a deep, bruised plum, and as Bhavani sank into it, the fabric felt unexpectedly cool against the backs of her thighs. The afternoon sun had shifted, abandoning the stark white of the French Quarter walls to dissolve into a thick, honeyed amber that pooled on the hardwood floors. She didn't pull her limbs inward or try to occupy the smallest possible sliver of the seat, as she usually did. Instead, she let her shoulders drop, her spine molding to the curve of the chair, feeling the heavy, comforting gravity of a body that finally knew it was welcome. Around her, the bookshop had exhaled. The tension of the mysterious figure on the balcony had not vanished, but it had settled into the background, like the distant hum of a ceiling fan. A shared silence had descended over the group, not the fragile silence of strangers afraid to speak, but a dense, rhythmic breathing that seemed to synchronize with the house itself. The air smelled of old paper, dried vanilla, and the lingering, sharp citrus of Natalie's lemon cake. Bhavani watched a single mote of dust dance in a shaft of light, its slow, erratic spiral mirroring the quiet drift of her own thoughts. Hima leaned back, her open palms resting on her knees, her face softened by a look of profound satisfaction. She fixed on Nathalie, then at the circle of friends, her gaze lingering on the way they had naturally converged in this small, sacred space. "There is a kind of magic in the things we do not plan," Hima said, her voice rich and enveloping, like a heavy wool blanket on a cool evening. She let out a soft, melodic chuckle that vibrated in the stillness. "I spent the morning worrying that the traditions of our neighborhood, the simple act of sharing a sweet or a smile, were becoming ghosts. But looking at this room, I see they have simply found a new home. This shop was a museum of silence, Natalie, but now it is a living thing." Natalie did not answer immediately. She was leaning against a towering shelf of leather-bound histories, her wire-rimmed glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of her nose. She didn't push them back. She simply looked at the group, her expression one of tentative wonder. For years she had treated these walls as a fortress, a way to keep the unpredictable noise of Pondicherry at bay. But as she watched Bhavani, whose presence felt like a soft light filling a dark corner, Nathalie realized that the stillness she had guarded so fiercely was not peace, but emptiness. The presence of others hadn't shattered the sanctuary. It had finally given the sanctuary a purpose. "I used to think the books were the only things here that could speak," Nathalie whispered, her French cadence curling around the words. She reached out, her fingertips barely brushing the spine of a volume nearby, a gesture of affection rather than curation. but the house feels fuller. It is a different kind of quiet now, a warmer one. For the first time in years, the habitual urge to shrink, to become a shadow against the yellow wall, vanished. She felt the weight of her own existence as something substantial and good. She thought of the flowers she sold every morning, the marigolds and night bloom scent, and realized she had spent her life treating herself like a petal, something beautiful but fragile, easily blown away by a sudden breeze. Here, in the plum-colored velvet of the chair, she felt like the root. She felt anchored. Beside her, Kishore cleared his throat. The sound was less a disruption and more a punctuation mark. He was staring at his pocket watch, but he didn't snap it shut with his usual military precision. He held it open, the gold casing catching the amber light, his thumb tracing the rim of the dial in a slow, rhythmic circle. "I find," Kishore began, his voice devoid of its usual sharp edges, "that my schedule has been remarkably inadequate today. I had allocated precisely 12 minutes for the transition from the courtyard to the interior, yet I have spent hours doing absolutely nothing of measurable productivity." He paused, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "It is the most efficient use of my time I can recall in a decade." Ishan, who had been quietly sketching the way the light hit Hima's profile, let out a soft laugh. He didn't look up from his pad, but his brush-stained thumb rubbed a smudge of cobalt blue into the margin of the page. The group lingered in that suspended moment, a collective exhale that seemed to stretch the seconds into minutes. Then the sound arrived. It was a low, resonant chime from the distant temple, the sound vibrating through the limestone and wood of the building. It was a sensory anchor, a signal that the peak of the day had passed and the world was beginning its slow tilt toward evening. The chime echoed, then faded, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt heavy with the realization that the magic of the morning was drawing to a close. As the group slowly began to stir, preparing to return to the lanes of the French Quarter, Bhavani felt a sudden, sharp impulse. She reached into the folds of her cotton saree and withdrew the small, yellowed slip of paper she had carried since the start of the day, the mysterious note that had first nudged her toward this encounter. She laid it side by side with the 40-year-old letter she had found tucked within the pages of the old book. Bhavani froze. She leaned forward, her head tilting as she scrutinized the ink. The ink on the old letter was faded, a ghostly sepia, while the ink on the note was a fresh, deep indigo. But the architecture of the letters, the elegant loop of the G, the way the teat was crossed with a slight, downward slant, the rhythmic spacing between the vowels, was identical. It wasn't just a similar style, it was the same hand. The same person who had written to her family 4 decades ago had written the note that brought her here today. Her breath hitched. She looked up, her gaze darting toward the ceiling, then toward the narrow stairs that led to the upper floors of the building. The indigo-shawled figure had not simply been a passerby or a curious neighbor. The person was still here, perhaps just a few feet above them, breathing the same air, watching the same amber light fade from the room. Bhavani felt a prickle of heat climb her neck. The comfort of the velvet chair suddenly felt like a trap, and the silence of the bookshop, once so welcoming, now felt like a held breath. She studied the letter, and then at the ceiling, the realization clicking into place with a cold, metal-sharp precision. The mystery wasn't a relic of the past, it was a living presence, and it had been waiting for her to arrive.